I want to introduce you to a wonderful woman who's come to talk to us about contemporary music. Her name is Anneli Loepp Thiessen. Thiessen? Yes. Oh, thank you, Lord. Now, she's a PhD student in the Interdisciplinary Music Research Program. I got that one right, too. And she's with the University of Ottawa. Her dissertation explores gender dynamics in the contemporary worship music industry. She has presented her research at numerous national and international conferences and is published in several academic journals, including the Hymn Journal of Contemporary Ministry Religions, which is coming out soon, and Worship, also forthcoming. She is a columnist for Leader magazine, the Canadian Mennonite, and there was a comma there, I did not see it. The Canadian Mennonite and the Hymn, and serves on planning committees for the Christian Congregational Music Conference and the Hymn Society of Canada and the United States. So we're going to wait with bated breath to hear all about contemporary music, Anneli. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is so good to be here with you and so fun for me to talk about this topic. This is my absolute favorite topic to talk about. I could talk about it for hours on end, so lucky for you I have a time limit, but I really do just think this is such an exciting and important thing for us to be talking about as church musicians, especially because we probably have a really big range of experiences with contemporary worship music. So for myself, I grew up in Kitchener-Waterloo, just an hour from here. I am still and have always been part of the Mennonite community. And so grew up in a church, my first 10 years in a church that kind of did hybrid worship, hymnody, also contemporary worship stuff. Then my dad planted a church in Kitchener that only did contemporary worship music. And so that was kind of my repertoire for my teenage years. And then went on to do my undergrad in piano performance and music ministry at Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg, where I took many academic courses on contemporary worship, kind of the hymnody, best practices. I did a course that was called Worship Band, where we learned how to lead contemporary worship, and it was like, use your arms properly or you'll only get a B. It was a very interesting context to be learning more about contemporary worship in a very applicable, practical way. And then most recently, I was on the committee for Voices Together, which is the new 2020 Mennonite hymnal. I was doing two things primarily on that, looking at the contributions of women to the collection and looking at contemporary worship music, and then noticing a really interesting crossover of those two areas, that there are just really few women who are successfully circulating their music in contemporary worship music. So I benefited from that process. I was the only committee member who got a dissertation topic out of it, but that's what I am writing about for my dissertation, so I think I lucked out with that. So like I mentioned, we have all of us come with different experiences of contemporary worship music, questions about what it is. We maybe have different things in our head when we're talking about contemporary worship music, and we're going to get into that in a second. But for now, I just want us to open by singing 10,000 Reasons, which is one of the most kind of widely sung songs from the 2010s by Chris Tomlin. So we're going to sing many of the songs. Some of the songs will be in More Voices or Voices United. All of them are from Voices Together. Yeah, a little apology. Everyone in the US is like, why does it matter that you called it Voices Together? And in Canada, people are like, you plagiarized the name Voices United. So apologies about that. But we're going to sing from the projection edition of Voices Together over here. Let's rise.
Worship your holy name.
So before we get any further, I'll just mention that this presentation that we're doing, some of the material is taken from a presentation I developed with my colleague Sarah Johnson, who teaches in liturgical studies at St. Paul University in Ottawa. She was also on the Voices Together committee, and so as we were talking about contemporary worship music with folks in our Mennonite communities, we developed some of this material. Some of it is new, but I just want to make sure that I highlight Sarah Johnson as a key contributor to lots of what we're talking about. She has some really powerful ideas about this too. So contemporary worship music has its origins in the mid-20th century, 1960s roughly, with even earlier roots in other liturgical movements that kind of led into contemporary worship really coming onto the scene in the 1960s. But again, there's so much leading up to that history that it really can't be designated to one place or time period. There are various ways that contemporary worship music is led in worship, ranging from a single guitar or single piano like we had this morning, to a small ensemble of 2 or 3 people, to a full band, which can have many, many people in it. The music often includes repeated verses and choruses, and is best learned orally without relying on notated music. Because it has a lot of syncopation, often people look at a page of contemporary worship and they're like, whoa, I can't do that. But if you listen to it, it's like, oh, this is very manageable. This kind of oral learning provides the opportunity for musicians to be improvisatory and spontaneous when desired, or they can also be rehearsed and predictable, which is great too. Trying to figure out what contemporary worship music actually is, for our committee for the Voices Together hymnal, I think we spent 6 months being like, well, what is it? and kind of trying to come up with an idea, and then someone would say, well, I still think Marty Haugen is contemporary worship music. We'd say, well, not really. Or someone else would say, well, Thiessen? Well, not really, but why not? Because they share so many of the same qualities. So we ended up kind of deciding that contemporary worship music for us is more of a family resemblance, things that have a lot of shared qualities, but there's not one really strict definition of what it is or isn't. That being said, Toronto's own Swee Hong Lim and Lester Ruth have done really incredible work on the history of contemporary worship music, and they have suggested kind of 9 qualities of contemporary worship. So they divide it into a few sections. You can follow there if you can read it. It's from their book, Lovin' on Jesus, which is from 2017. So they suggest that it uses contemporary, non-archaic English. It's dedicated to relevance regarding contemporary concerns and issues in the lives of worshipers. There's a commitment to adapt worship to match contemporary people, sometimes to the level of strategic targeting, really thinking about who is in the audience or the congregation. Musically, it uses musical styles from current types of popular music. So if you're listening to the radio and then you come to worship, it might have similar beats, similar instruments, similar melodies. I often talk about this as a really unique strength of contemporary worship music, and you know, think about when I was 10 years old, and my dad had started this church plant, and we were really deeply connected to our local neighborhood. And there was this girl named Savannah, who was my age, who I'd gotten to know, you know, on the playground, and then she came to church. And I knew she had no church background and no musical training. And I remember standing with her at 10 years old in worship, and she was singing along like she knew the songs, every single song, and I knew she had never heard them before, but it sounded like what she knew, and with just the words, it was easy for her to enter in. And so I remember standing there being like, wow, like, this is amazing, because in my previous church, that would not have been the case. She would not have been able to join in quite as easily. So that's definitely one strong musical characteristic. Often extended times of uninterrupted congregational singing. That's kind of in its home context. In my Mennonite context, sometimes that's the case. Often it's interspersed with other aspects of a liturgical order as well. Centrality of the musicians in the liturgical space and in the leadership of the service. You'll have a visible song leader, visible bands, and they'll often be somewhat of a visible focal point. Behaviorally, there's greater levels of physical expressiveness. We'll kind of experiment with some of that this morning too. When you're not holding a hymnal, you can do things with your arms, which is really interesting. And then a kind of predisposition for informality. So people come in with their Starbucks and their jeans, and that as with all of these, you might be like, yeah, that's my church too, and we don't do contemporary worship. And so it's hard to draw those lines. That's why we talk about family resemblance. They kind of talk about the Supreme Court line of like, you know it when you see it, which I think is sort of helpful for thinking about contemporary worship. But people in our committee would be like, I know it when I see it, and it's Marty Haugen. And so it's tough to draw those lines, and that's something we constantly kind of need to negotiate and really immerse ourselves deeply in it so that we can tell what are we talking about here and what are the differences between some of these expressions. So to help us understand kind of the breadth of contemporary worship music as a liturgical movement that is beyond just evangelical communities, but has pervaded music and worship in the Mennonite Church and the Catholic Church and the United Church, I draw on my colleague Sarah Johnson's experience of participating in this music as a liturgical ethnographer. She went to so many different, and still goes to many, many different worshiping communities. And so these are her words about different places she's encountered contemporary worship, and I think they really help us to understand that this is no longer a movement that's housed in one kind of way of worshiping, but it has transcended and is so prominent among all of our ways of Christian worshiping. So she says at the Syro-Malabar Cathedral in Chicago, Sarah was the only woman not wearing a sari or other traditional Indian dress. This Eastern Christian community anchors its history and liturgy in the ministry of the Apostle Thomas in India in the 1st century. In addition to songs in the Malayalam language, they sang Hillsong's Lead Me to the Cross. She also sang contemporary worship music at the Metropolitan Community Church in San Francisco, which is a progressive tradition that was among the first to affirm the full participation of LGBTQ+ people. They sang a song from Hillsong as well, Shout to the Lord. At the University of Notre Dame, a Roman Catholic student group regularly practices Eucharistic adoration accompanied by praise and worship music, which is another way of saying contemporary worship music. At a vigil in Las Vegas, following the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history, the community gathered on the steps of City Hall did not sing Amazing Grace, but instead sang the contemporary worship song, How Great Is Our God. This worship music is present in most recent Protestant hymnals, including hymnals published in the Presbyterian and Reformed traditions, and is also present in Voices United and More Voices. Contemporary worship music is pervasive. It is sung across Christian traditions, Eastern and Western, Catholic and Protestant, conservative and progressive, large and small, rural and urban. When we sing contemporary worship music, we are singing with a diverse and ecumenical community of Christians. As I've been learning more about the historical context of contemporary worship music, a few things stand out to me. The first is that contemporary worship was developed really intentionally. It was developed out of a desire to create more space in worship for personal reflection, emotional connection, and room to grow in an individual relationship with God. This came out of a time in history, and there certainly is not only one time in history like this, where many worshipers weren't experiencing this kind of intimacy and connection in worship, and they were craving it. They wanted more space for that personal dialogue with God. I think often people critique this personal aspect of contemporary worship music, often without actually realizing that this isn't a byproduct that they don't know is happening. This was very intentional to be able to offer something different in worship than what people around its inception were experiencing. The other thing that we can pull from contemporary worship's history is that it's lasting. It has been so exciting to see this core repertoire of contemporary worship music develop over the last 60 years, for sure over my lifetime, and I just know that it goes back way before I was born. I think sometimes we carry this anxiety about the amount of new material that is produced in contemporary worship, worrying we will never learn it all. I'm happy to report I also have not learned all of the hymns. And so there's an inevitability that there will be more out there than we can ever manage. But there is, just like there is in hymnody, this core repertoire that we've developed. You'll likely know many or some of the songs from this morning, which is a testament to the fact that there are these core songs that are sung across traditions. So like we talk about the history of it, I want to just mention that when it first emerged, one of the common ways of expressing contemporary worship was setting biblical texts to song and singing those in a repetitive way so that they could, kind of simple choruses that we could kind of soak into. So we're going to sing Seek Ye First, which is by Karen Lafferty. This is an early contemporary worship song from 1976. And so we'll just sing Seek Ye First, then we'll do verse 2, and then we'll sing the Alleluia as a refrain. So we're going to head into talking a little bit about the musical context for contemporary worship music. Speaking of this context, I'll just mention, as you're kind of trying to determine what is and what isn't contemporary worship in our head, and I know singing Seek Ye First kind of throws into a wrench into any definition you may have thought you were developing, but it's part of this historical canon that we come from. From my perspective, what I see, and I have not done a super deep dive into More Voices and Voices United, but we're going to sing All Who Are Thirsty in a little bit, which I would consider to be a contemporary worship song. Better is One Day in Your House, which we, Your Love Makes Me Sing, we already sang, and then Seek Ye First. Those would be kind of my primary examples from the current United Church collections. So the first thing I want to say about the musical context of contemporary worship is that it's incredibly singable. I think singability is one of these things we throw around when we're talking about if a song works for a congregation, and there's so many dynamics that go into our definition of what is singable or what isn't singable. I have sometimes heard people say contemporary worship music is unsingable, which comes from, I would say, a very privileged kind of intellectual position. It's a tradition that's best learned by ear, and as is evidenced by the millions of people who sing contemporary worship music every week, it is singable, especially when it is learned by ear. But it's not singable in the way that you would say a traditional hymn is singable in terms of how it's learned. And so we just have to broaden our definition of what singability is. Like I mentioned this story about Savannah at my church joining in, even though she had no church or musical background. It's just singable in a different way. And so it's actually, I think, a really good stretch for musicians to have to be like, okay, I have to engage syncopation here. We pride ourselves on being incredible church musicians with such strong gifts, and then we see syncopation and it's like, it's just bad music. But it's just a stretch. It's tough. It's hard. I also really struggle with it, and I've been doing this for years. So it's tough if we're coming from that kind of classical mindset. But listening to it just opens up whole new possibilities for it. So the second thing I would say about the musical context is that it's participatory. I think about a professor I had in my undergrad who is like, especially in our Mennonite context where we often have one song leader at the front of a church, she was like, I love this because you get collaborative leadership. Like the drummer is part of the leadership of the song, the bass guitarist is an important part, multiple singers. It kind of reduces the hierarchy of one song leader or one music director or one organist, which I think is really, really valuable. And because it has kind of it's easy for people with less musical training to join in on, that also means that the music ministry can be participatory for people who don't have that really strict classical training that sometimes is kind of like a minimum standard for participating in music ministry. I think when we talk about contemporary worship music being participatory, sometimes people hearken up this fear that it's really performative in a way that like the emphasis is just on the guitar solo or it's just on the solo singer. I think it's important for us to contextualize those fears in our broader understanding of performance in music. There's not much different between an organ prelude and a guitar solo. They are both solo instruments sharing their gift. Not much difference between a soloist chanting a psalm and a soloist singing the first verse. They have the same liturgical effect. We just need to kind of reframe how we're thinking about people doing things individually in a service. The other thing is, I mentioned earlier contemporary worship music is really intentionally it intentionally leans into that kind of intimate language, that personal devotion. That is true, and that is certainly true of the origin of contemporary worship music, but then people can run into critiques of like, well, we need to sing as a collective, we need to sing as a group, we can't just sing individually. And so what's interesting is that is true of the origin of contemporary worship and is very intentional and still is true of many songs today. But my professor in undergrad, Christine Longhurst, did a survey. It's a study called The Words We Sing, which is published in the journal Direction. She surveyed 509 of the top contemporary worship songs written from the late 90s to 2011 and found that 34% of those were from an individualistic standpoint. And then she surveyed Hymnal Worship Book, which is our recent Mennonite book, which is very comparable to Voices United or any other kind of hymn book from the 90s, and she found that 29 of those were from an individual standpoint. So 29 to 34 is incidental. It's really not a big difference. So this kind of idea that we have that all contemporary worship music is individual, it's not true. And similarly, much of our hymnody is individual. And so it just kind of, when we look at the actual facts of it, we're getting beyond these stereotypes that have sometimes dictated how we view this. Moving now a little bit into the textual content. So I want to throw up these two images here. This is an illustration for contemporary worship, again developed by Sarah Johnson, and I think it's such a brilliant way of thinking about it and kind of reframing how we analyze worship songs by comparing them to these two works of art. So neither of these works depict some sort of objective reality. The Dutch still life painting on the left is hyper-realistic. The lemons shine, the glass is pristine, the composition is immaculate. We see this as analogous to contemporary hymn text writing with clear images that depict a story in a really concrete way. The imagery is crisp, the rhymes are perfect, the metaphors are complex and developed. It's beautiful and it communicates in a very particular way. The French Impressionist painting on the right is impressionistic and evocative. The edges are blurred, unexpected colors are present, light refracts in rough, repeated brush strokes. And we can see this as a way of thinking about the lyrics of praise and worship music or contemporary worship music. It's a different kind of poetry than contemporary hymn writing. It is often impressionistic and evocative. It juxtaposes unexpected metaphors. It repeats phrases rather than constructing sentences. So it's beautiful when it's understood as communicating in a different way. To say contemporary worship music is bad because it doesn't perfectly rhyme like hymns is like saying the edges are too blurred on the one on the right and they should be crisper like the one on the left. They're just different and they are intended to have different strengths and they're beautiful in their own ways. And that's something to celebrate instead of to kind of be concerned about. I want to address repetition a little bit. My dad, who loves contemporary worship, recounts a story of being with a colleague who said, you know what I really can't stand about contemporary worship is the repetition. And my dad remembers saying, well, you must hate the Hallelujah chorus. And I think this is kind of representative of a little bit of a double standard we have when it comes to repetition in congregational song. I remember growing up in Kitchener-Waterloo, there was a point where it felt like everybody and their dog was talking about Thiessen music and going to Thiessen worship events and singing Thiessen and traveling to Thiessen in France. And I love Thiessen, and I also went to Thiessen services, and I have also visited the Thiessen community in France. But I noticed that it's okay for Thiessen to be repetitive, to sing the same song for literally 20 minutes. But then when contemporary worship music does it, it becomes the butt of the joke. There's the joke, I mean, it's a very smart joke, that contemporary worship music is 7-11, 7 words 11 times, which is also Thiessen, though. And so we have this kind of double standard, and I think what I want to gently suggest and what I want us to sit with is when we hold this kind of double standard around these things, what are the actual differences? And I think an upholding of Western art music is kind of the image of the best congregational song, is why Thiessen music, which looks like a hymn, sits on a page, follows all the same copyright laws, is available on one license, is a beautiful way of experiencing repetition. And contemporary worship music, which comes from musical communities that our traditional Western art music congregational song has not identified with, suddenly becomes other, different, a bit of a threat. And so it's something for all of us to sit with, is what are the expectations we have about kind of traditional Western hymnody, and what are we allowing traditional Western hymnody to do that we wouldn't extend the same kind of grace to other expressions of congregational song. So speaking of repetition, we're going to sing All Who Are Thirsty, which is found in More Voices as number 4, but it'll also be up on the screen. And I'm actually going to encourage you to look up at the screen because I want to give us permission to explore postures of prayer that we see so much in throughout church history, assuming different postures of prayer. And when we have our hands available, because we're following the screen, we can actually do that in a different way. And so, were you able to see the screen when you were standing for 10,000 Reasons? You were. Okay. So I'm going to have us stand, and when we get to the refrain, we're going to sing it through, and we're just going to sing the refrain a few times, and I invite you to open your hands as an expression of inviting God into this space. Sometimes I'm grateful when people give me permission to do that. I've often been in settings where I was like, I'd really like to try holding my hands up and see what it was like, but it feels tabooed. And so this is the safe space where I want you to do that and use your physical posture to invite God's presence with us. So we can go to the next. next slide. You want the verse at the beginning? Yeah, we'll do the verse at the beginning, thanks. You can go, Josh, to the next one. The content of contemporary worship music will be our next topic here, and it's incredibly diverse. When we were looking at contemporary worship music for Voices Together, we were able to identify contemporary worship songs that fit in almost every category of our table of contents, which would be similar to the Voices United or More Voices table of contents, with all of the different acts of worship and the different parts of the Christian story. So we were able to find that the words were diverse, and people are writing into really unique contexts like foot washing and baptism and confessing our faith with creeds. There are contemporary worship songs for all of these things. But it's also striking how much the lyrics of contemporary worship music have changed, have evolved, have expanded over the past 50 or 60 years. We found that earlier material was pretty uniformly focused on praise for Jesus. That was such, like we talked about, an emphasis of those early songs, praise and adoration, the authority and transcendence of God, this personal connection with Jesus. Those were really important themes, and they remain really important themes. But contemporary worship music is responsive to critique and suggestion and has grown to cover a really big breadth of these topics, to be more Trinitarian, to reflect on communion, to talk about the seasons of the Christian year, the traditional creeds, to express lament in addition to this praise that is so important. It draws on a range of sources, including scripture, of course, like Seek Ye First is such a good example of that. It also adapts traditional hymns. There have been movements to add refrains to traditional hymns, incorporating African-American spirituals in an appropriate context, and then drawing on ancient church sources as well. There are also a few groups that are doing really exciting things in broadening the kind of textual content of contemporary worship music. So I'll just highlight Porter's Gate as one ensemble that you may want to look at. It's an intentionally diverse worship songwriting collective. They've written quite a few albums and are still coming out with more. They've written albums on neighbors, on working and labor, on climate justice, on justice in general. They're currently collaborating with Sanctuary in the UK on one on mental health. So they're writing songs into these topics that we know that we need to be singing about in our church communities, and they're doing it from a contemporary worship perspective. When we look at the top 100 of Christian Copyright Licensing International, which is our top 100 list of the most reported songs, kind of like radio's top 40, you might find that some of the songs don't resonate with your theology. And I would say I also often feel this way when I'm looking at top lists of hymns, like you might find on Hymnary, like How Great Thou Art, Onward Christian Soldiers, Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven, don't capture what I want to be singing about in church. And similarly, there are songs on the CCLI Went Top 100 that also do not capture what I want to be singing about in church. They might be appropriate for some Sundays, but they don't capture what I want to be singing. But similarly to top lists of hymns like we would find on Hymnary, there are so many factors that go into that, including their longevity over time, their prevalence in other parts of the world. Like there's all of these factors that contribute to what make up these top songs. So my encouragement for us is to take that seriously and look at the CCLI Top 100 because there's some great stuff on there, and also to say this cannot capture everything that we would want to be singing, just like our top lists of hymns also don't capture everything that we need to be singing about. We are going to sing another song right away called Christ Be All Around Me, which is by a contemporary worship duo that was active during the 2010s, All Sons and Daughters. It's based on a 5th century text, which is ascribed to Saint Patrick. It's a delightful fusion of streams of content we were looking for with Voices Together, caring for hymns written before the Reformation and texts from before them, and contemporary worship music. One of the things that I love doing with this piece is doing it at Ontario Mennonite Music Camp, which is a music camp that I directed for a few years. Matt Buda worked there. And we did the song, we added actions. And I think, again, it's a great way to kind of embody the message of this piece. So we're going to move again. We're going to rise again if you are able. And if not, you can feel free to do the actions seated. Here we go. Actions are just on the chorus, and I'll do them then. Here we go. As I rise, strength of God, go before, lift me up. As I wake, eyes of God, look on me. Be my side. Here we go to verse 2. As I wait, heart of God, satisfied and sustained. As I hear, voice of God, lead me on. Be my God, be my God. when we were working on establishing Voices Together, that was a process from 2016 to when it was published in 2020, our committee got a grant from the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship to visit Mennonite communities in North America that worshiped in languages other than English. So went everywhere from British Columbia to Ohio to Florida, all over the place. It led to some really, really powerful songs being included in the community that we were able to, that wouldn't have made it into our process in other ways. But when our committee was there and hearing them and could speak with the composers and could do notations themselves and could take recordings, we were able to include some of those pieces. What it also revealed is that an overwhelming number of these communities were worshiping with contemporary worship music. So for our committee, this meant that singing with our intercultural neighbors meant singing contemporary worship music. And often these songs were from big megachurches like Hillsong. We recognize that it is not our job to determine what people, especially our siblings from outside of North America, should be singing. And instead, we viewed it as our job to represent that music in our collection. I also want to acknowledge that part of singing interculturally means singing what our siblings around the world are actually singing. I think sometimes we have romanticized ideas of what a global song is, and we're so keen to sing Sia Humba. It looks beautiful on the page, everyone knows it, and it's a great song. But a global song, if we're wanting to represent other music, might be Waymaker, which is a contemporary worship song at the absolute top of the charts right now, which comes from a woman songwriter named Sinach in Nigeria. Her song has been absolutely picked up in Nigeria. Her YouTube video viewed over 200 million times, gained a lot of traction upon its release in 2016 with black churches in the US, and then unfortunately only when a white contemporary worship ensemble covered it did white churches start singing it. But if we're going to take seriously singing global songs and singing with our neighbors around the world, we have to move beyond the kind of music that we thought was global song in the 80s and 90s, and that might involve singing contemporary worship music as a way of actually recognizing what other communities are singing. And it means a whole bunch of different expressions. I certainly don't want to suggest that contemporary worship music is the only way to do that, but I think it's a really important one. Similarly, for several years, I was the director of Ontario Mennonite Music Camps, I mentioned, and consistently, without fail, the favorite song of our campers was My Lighthouse. I have also heard from Josh that this was a favorite song of the Go Project, which I'm sure you are familiar with. So I will always, until my dying day, say that contemporary worship music is not just for young people, but I also think that it does reach youth in a really special way because it's easy to latch onto. A few years ago, I heard our next speaker, Deb Bradley, say that you can't say I don't like that music without saying I don't like those people. And I've used that line 1,000 times since. I think it's brilliant. But for me in Mennonite Church Canada, if I'm saying I don't like contemporary worship music, I'm saying something I don't want to be saying about other kinds of people that are singing contemporary worship music in Canada. So it can be a scary statement. So we're going to sing, you can stay seated for this one, we're going to sing Shout to the Lord, which we have included in Voices Together also in Spanish as a way of recognizing the traction that this song has. Oh, before we get to that, thanks Josh. It's amazing. I know, I would only ask my husband to get up and down off the floor so many times for this. This is a list of the contemporary worship music in languages other than English that we included in Voices Together. So you can see quite a strong representation of Spanish, some French, some German, and then we have one song in Indonesian, and there could be so much more. Like, this is really just the tip of the iceberg, but just kind of an example of the ways that this genre is prevalent in our music from around the world as well. So we're going to sing Shout to the Lord. We'll sing the verse and the chorus in English, and then we'll just do the chorus again in Spanish, and we can try that out together.
The wonders of your mind.
So that kind of gives us an overview of musical content, textual context, historical context, ecumenical context. I want to talk a little bit about tips for learning and teaching contemporary worship music, because I recognize, myself included, so many of us, I did the piano lessons, ARCT, Masters of Music and Piano Performance. I did that and was steeped in that, and I know that switching gears can be hard. It's when I'm teaching piano students now, I'm always like, we're learning chords, we're going to have syncopation, we're doing lead sheets, because I think these are like such integral skills. But a lot of us didn't get that. I didn't get that in my lessons growing up. So my first tip is to listen on repeat. Listen, listen, listen again, keep listening. Listen to different versions of it. Like acoustic versions will often be a little bit more accessible. You'll have like 10,000 Reasons and then 10,000 Reasons acoustic. So if you want something that might sound more like the instruments you have in your church, that's a really good option. So just keep getting it in your head, in your body, in your fingers. Try playing along to the recording. But really, I find having it in your head so that you can, as close as you can to playing it by ear, will be really helpful. Second, I suggest taking it one step at a time. There is no need to do right off the bat full contemporary worship, especially even just one song with a community that's not prepared for it. Listen to it for prelude. Maybe you play it for prelude. Maybe if you play music, I don't know, if you're the kind of church that plays music in the foyer as people are coming in, play it just so that they start to have it in their ear. And then maybe you want to have someone sing just the verse and they join in on the chorus for 1 week, and then the next week they can come in on the verses too. So just take it step by step. It takes a while for anyone in any new kind of style or context to become comfortable with something, so there's no rush. Allow yourself to make mistakes. Unlike traditional hymnody, there's no contract here. There's no like, well, on the page it says. It was fun. I mean, this is a little different, but with some camp songs and Voices Together, it was like there's a different way of singing it for every province in Canada. And it would be pretty much impossible to say which one is right. And so I think the same thing can go for contemporary worship music. Like, because it's oral tradition, it will evolve, and that's great. And so if you're singing it differently than it's written on the page, or differently than the recording, or each recording will do it differently, there just aren't rules in that same way. And so be free with it. And even if you're following something like a CCLI lead sheet, even that is not objectively, you can feel free to take some liberties with that too. So yeah, just release yourself from any expectation that it has to sound a certain way. And realistically, in many of our communities, it is not sounding, my community for sure, it's not sounding like it's sounding on YouTube. And that's a good normal thing. Learning community, because contemporary worship songs in their origin were sung, or not maybe so much in their origin, the current songs we're singing, especially in origin, were led by an ensemble, written by multiple people. You may find it enjoyable to learn these with others, to have a group that goes over this together, gets together and explores some of them. It's really helpful to have percussion for contemporary worship because it's syncopated. It's helpful to have that strong beat. So if you're not a percussionist, invite a percussionist or hire a percussionist and explore that together. And then 5 would be explore the breadth of contemporary worship, kind of like I suggested before. Don't limit yourself to whatever's the most popular right now, the highest on the charts. There's great stuff there, but there's so much good stuff buried elsewhere. And so explore putting contemporary worship for creation care or whatever you're going to be exploring, and you'll find a whole bunch of things. And in Voices Together, we have some piano accompaniments we have about, well, it depends how you, again, this family resemblance. We have somewhere between 30 and 60 contemporary worship songs in Voices Together, and we have accompaniments for, I think, all of them. And so, like, my church has an ensemble that often leads contemporary worship. We do a lot of traditional hymns, and sometimes we'll have a contemporary worship song led by our pianist who's only ever done traditional stuff, and it sounds great with the accompaniment that she has learned note by note, right? She's not doing it in this oral, playing by ear, chording kind of way. She's playing literally what's on the accompaniment, but it sounds really beautiful. And so there's lots of those available online, or you can buy books of them, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a great way to especially get comfortable with what it could or should sound like. So I just want to highlight a few other additional resources here. The first is Lovin' on Jesus, which I highlighted. The 9 characteristics are from this book, and I really can't recommend it enough. I think if you were going to go out and buy one book on contemporary worship, I would highly recommend that one. It's just a really good overview of things. Same authors, Lester, Ruth, and Sui Hong Lim, did a history of contemporary praise and worship, which is a little bit more in-depth historically, but also really incredible. And I will just do a plug, if you're interested in this, Christ Be All Around Me that we did the actions for, one of those songwriters is Leslie Jordan. She's going to be doing a hymn festival at the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada. Our conference this summer in Montreal, which is on land, language, and liberation. So she's going to be there doing contemporary worship one evening. Lester Ruth is going to be doing a plenary address. So if you're interested in this, it's going to be an amazing conference for a number of reasons, but there will be some good contemporary worship representation there. Singing the Congregation by Monique Ingalls is a good kind of overview. These three are all a little bit more academic. Love on Jesus is pretty accessible. Of the kind of different contexts contemporary worship music is done in, especially in the United States. I just plugged in Justice songs there. That's a Porter's Gate album. That's just one example if you were interested. The United Methodist Church has done a project where they go through the CCLI Top 100 and give them red light, yellow light, or green light, depending on the theology and how much it resonates with their United Methodist theology. And so that's all available, including their rationale, if you want to check that out, and you can see what they gave red, green, yellow lights. It's really interesting to think, too, how does United Church of Canada differ from their theology, or how does Mennonite differ? But they also have included some recommendations that aren't on that CCLI list, again, recognizing there's so much good stuff that for a million reasons does not make it to number one, but should still be circulated. Conversations on Contemporary Worship on the far right is a podcast hosted by Adam Perez, who's a professor at Belmont University in Nashville, who focuses on contemporary worship. Just really good conversations, especially with some scholars on this. Below that, you can't really see it probably, but there's a guide to contemporary worship in Voices Together, available on the Voices Together website, which is voicestogetherhymnal.org. I think it's org or net. You can put in Voices Together Hymnal. And we just kind of did what is contemporary worship? What are our contemporary songs and voices together? What are the Anabaptist songs that wouldn't necessarily be known in the same way but have that same form? The tips for leading that I highlighted are in there. So some good stuff there. And then Word to Worship is a tool where you can plug in a scripture reading and get contemporary worship recommendations of songs. And so highly recommend that too. So that kind of wraps up. This has been a whirlwind of information, wraps up what I was planning to chat about, but I would really like to I think we should have a few minutes for questions, because I would love to know what is resonating, what you're struggling with, just kind of to take any of those questions, and I think we can use this mic here. So if anyone has any questions, happy to take those.
Thank you so much for this. I've really enjoyed and appreciated this presentation. This is kind of an academic question, and maybe other people would be sort of interested in this. How would you define the difference between the songs from Hillsong and from the Vineyard?
Oh, interesting. Do you mean Vineyard specifically as a movement, or just from those
the songs coming out of Vineyard?
Okay. I think part of the difference is that we're seeing Hillsong absolutely skyrocket in success to in this kind of megachurch sphere. There was just a study released this week about how pretty much all contemporary worship songs that are ranking on these charts are coming out of megachurches. And so I think that's a huge thing that's shaping that theology. I think there's this really interesting, and then Vineyard 2 is just a little bit older, has a little bit more of that historical background, founded by John Wimber, who is a huge component in this history of contemporary worship music, but doesn't have that same, I think, kind of one lead pastor dictating the theology that Hillsong as a megachurch would have. So I think you're going to notice some differences, but we also just aren't seeing, Hillsong is having its music moment now, whereas Vineyard has had its music moment. So there's going to be a difference in just kind of realistically the styles of them, because they peaked in two very different popular music climates. Yes, totally. But they're comparable points, and they, especially old Vineyard and new Hillsong would have lots of, I study this a lot, and you could put on, I don't find it easy to be oh, this sounds like a Hillsong, or oh, this sounds like a Vineyard, or oh, this sounds like a Bethel. They're often sharing a lot of the same characteristics, I would say. Thanks. Yeah.
I come from a congregation that we do a lot of mixed music, traditional and a lot of contemporary. Many are enthusiastic, and However, there's been some requests for this, I don't know if I'm getting her name right, Lauren Daigle, does that ring a bell? And she sounds like Adele, and a lot of her lyrics aren't directly God mentioning. Any insight on that? Because those are going to be coming up probably in if people are on board with those.
Totally. It's this very interesting thing that you're touching on that I've actually just been exploring in the last couple of weeks for my dissertation, which is this the interaction between this worship industry and radio. And historically we had in the 90s, early 2000s, this really clear divide. You had I don't know if these names ring a bell, but a Toby Mac, which no one would ever think about singing in church. That was a Christian radio moment. You'd go to a Toby Mac concert, but you're not about to sing that in church. And then you had your worship music. And now we're seeing more worship music being played on radio. And I wonder if the effect is people are well, worship is on radio, so anything on radio can be worship. And yeah, Lauren Daigle she is not intending for her music to be sung by a congregation. In fact, I think she's, her song You Say, da, 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 which is very popular when, on radio, in movies, very, very popular, really probably intended for that secular market from a Christian singer, which we've seen a few times throughout history, and not for a congregation. So I think, we talk about what's singable, but also what's appropriate, and I think it just might not be. And so just saying where does this fit in our order of service? Put theological questions on it. What statement is this making about God? What have that conversation. And if you can find a way to make it work, there's no inherent reason not to, I think. Right. Right. Well, and then it's also it was written for a soloist. Sure, we can do that. We can all be soloists, but is that going to have the effect that we're looking for, or are we better off picking something that was written a little bit with a different context in mind? I think I've actually had this exact conversation about You Say with other people too, where they're our youth want to sing You Say. What do we do? And I think, why not? If your youth is I want to, or maybe it's not a youth in this case, whoever it is saying I want to offer this, be absolutely, do you want to do that as special music? Do you want to do that as prelude? Do you want to, finding a way to incorporate it? And there's nothing inherently wrong about it. It just is not meant for this, so it might be tricky, would be what I would say. Yeah. We had a question here, I think.
You are talking about music you found. You are talking about music you found. You are talking about music you've already found. Where do I find this music? The only thing I see the word to worship there. And there's a familiarity with, this is a word that as a musician drives me nuts, genre. Because when I was young, there was no genre. We just played music, right? And so it's that compartmentalizing and things. But that's brilliant, the word to worship, because I plan worship. So I've got a passage of scripture, and I want to find a contemporary piece to go with that. But now that I've found it, how do I evaluate it and judge it? And then, what if I can't find something from here, yet I want to do something like where do you find the music to be able to develop it and grow it in your own congregation?
Yeah, totally. It's a great question. There are a couple of different ways of going about this. One of the realities about this is as it closely mimics popular music in so many facets, it also mimics popular music in terms of the market. And so it's very easy for me as a young person who's always on social media. That's how I find my new pieces. If you start following on Facebook or wherever, Porter's Gate or some of these other people that you might find that are doing some of this stuff, you might see some of that. But I think also CCLI is really trying to make an interface that's accessible to people who are wanting to find for specific themes. So they have what's it called? It might be called liturgy kind of tab on the left, where you can enter in a liturgical theme or a liturgical season, and they'll pull stuff up for you from that. So I think they are trying to recognize that people are how do I find this? I think in terms of evaluating, you just need to have your own criteria. My, again, prof in undergrad said I always look at the lyrics first, and if I don't like the lyrics, I'm not even going to listen to it. And I was that's terrible. But now, having done a hymnal process, I'm absolutely, that's brilliant. So I think figure out what your criteria is, maybe look at the United Methodist red light, green light situation and see what you would want to take from that, and then just scanning and looking at words. And the other thing that I would mention kind of on this language component is if folks know 10,000 Reasons, you may have noticed that we got permission to change his to your. So there are situations where little changes like that can be made pretty manageably, I would say. And so if it's just a matter of 1 or 2 words that don't sit right, I don't think the police are coming after anyone. I think it's okay to have a little bit of liberty. Changing on a huge scale feels different. But so coming up with your own evaluative things, CCLI, following people on social media. There are charts like Worship Together that are different than CCLI that have their own kind of criteria for listing things. And so you can listen there. And then the other thing I'd recommend is Spotify or Apple Music playlists. They'll do like new in worship this week, and that might be a place to find some stuff too. But the other thing is that if you have a copy of Voices Together, you can access the guide online. We also have a playlist on YouTube of all the contemporary worship music and Voices Together. So if you want stuff that we have kind of vetted as our committee while you wait for Then Let Us Sing, you can access that too. So I hope that gives some places to start. One at the back, yeah.
Thank you. So I guess my question is my congregation is coming around to new things. We're starting to move a little bit. We have a new minister who's, let me hear an amen, and they say amen. And we have a liturgical dancer who's getting them to dance and do things. I guess my issue, or not, I don't know if issue is the right word, my difficulty is finding the right piece of music that matches our theology. Our church rents out our sanctuary on Good Friday morning for the Baptist church. And our church congregates at one of the other United churches. And, I had to work the sound system for the Baptist church, and they had the band, the worship praise band, and I watched them rehearse, and I thought, oh, this is really cool, but what does the congregation do? Man, did they sing. They were just like, the church had 600 people in it, and they just, with their hearts, they sang. And then I went and watched ours, which was online, and we have some beautiful music, but it just didn't do it for me. But then I didn't like their theology and in many of it. So I guess my question is, how do you find United Church theology in contemporary music?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, unfortunately, one of the realities is you just have to sift through stuff. I think, with hymnody, like with Voices Together, and I think this is somewhat standard practice, 50% of our hymnal is what was previously published. So there's like a lineage of people who've sifted through it by the time we get to it, and that makes it pretty easy. But we don't have that with contemporary worship. And so with our contemporary worship committee for Voices Together, we had to sift through so much. But then it's sifted through, and you've got some great stuff. And so it's a little bit of a time investment, I would say, going through CCLI. But also, I think, chat with others, like the Center for Congregational Song has done some good stuff on highlighting contemporary worship music that's written with maybe a little bit more progressive theology. And so that can be a place to look. There's a band called The Many, which is real contemporary worship, really passionate about LGBTQ plus inclusion. So they might have some good stuff that would fit that. Convergence, sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's people around who can have some suggestions, and it would actually be interesting maybe in what's the name of the Facebook group that I'm in? But to ask that question, like, what are the progressive United Church of Canada contemporary worship songs that we're singing? And I think crowdsourcing could be a great way to kind of pull that list together. And again, I think the Then Let Us Sing committee is doing some of that, so hopefully they'll be able to suggest some things. You can check out the Voices Together ones that we've kind of gone through and said, we think this works. And then, yeah, following groups like Porter's Gate. I'm really mentioning them a lot. I'm not getting a cut for them, but I think that they're doing a really good job of writing on kind of different themes, and sometimes the theology and language would match up with what we're looking for, and sometimes it won't, and that's okay. It's another place we have to sift. Yeah, so I wish there was like a shortcut. Maybe this is a call to write a blog post or something like that that's highlighting 10 songs that feel like green light songs in the United Church. Again, the United Methodist Project, I think, would be a really good one. And there is actually, so if anyone wants to talk to me about this, the Center for Congregational Song, which is a branch of the Hymn Society, is doing a project where they're trying to recreate this United Methodist green light, red light situation ecumenically. And I don't think there's anyone from the United Church of Canada on that group yet. And so we're looking at what are our green light, red light songs for Mennonites, what are the green light, red light songs for Anglicans, what are the green light, red light for Baptists, and seeing where they overlap. So hopefully there will be more resources like that coming out that help us see what are green light resources in other communities too. Yeah.
Hello, I'm wondering, because I saw that article about the top songs and the connection to worship bands at specific megachurches. I'm wondering how much there might be an interest on the business side of creating new worship materials that's wanting to point people towards particular offerings, whereas perhaps for us in the United Church, we might be better served. Maybe, I think a red light, green light is good, but maybe it's stifling other new expressions that might pop up that are also contemporary and also modern, but not feeding into that one kind of marketing system. I don't like to put it that way, but I think there's an element of that, perhaps. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reality is that whatever form of congregational song we're doing, probably there's labor that has gone into it and there's payment that happens. Like I get royalty checks every year for some of my songs, and they're not as much as they are for Hillsong, but it's the same system. And so, you know, I'm always hesitant to say, well, we don't want to contribute to capitalism. Well, I mean, the way to do that is not to not sing contemporary worship, because we're contributing pretty much no matter what we're doing. But I do think, I will mention another kind of thing for someone out there to run with. From a Mennonite side of things, we just got a grant again from the Calvin Institute to host an Anabaptist songwriting retreat focused on writing contemporary worship music. And so that'll all be written from an Anabaptist theological perspective. And then our goal, we have said right off the bat that that's all going to be public domain and freely available on togetherinworship.net, which is our free resources website that has recently launched. And so, you know, there's some funding out there if you wanted to do a United Church of Canada songwriting weekend to write contemporary worship, or to, you know, brainstorm and pull together what are these kind of alternative, not necessarily, it's not going to sound the same necessarily, it's not going to be as polished, I know, for us, but to get that kind of idea, that same musical idiom, and kind of explore it on our own terms, with our own kind of funding structure or marketing structure or whatever it is. So I think of both, and there are so many good ways to explore alternatives, and the reality is that we have markets and consumerism everywhere, and so to you know, be aware. I think I got more aware of that doing the hymnal project than ever. Like, it's just a lot of money, because copyright is always so expensive no matter what genre we're in. But yeah, there's so much room for creativity, and that's just always exciting to kind of explore. Absolutely. We're done. Yes, that's great.